Salisbury, Rhodesia, spring of 1970. I stood on a firing range watching a guy put 5 rounds into a target at 100 meters and miss the entire goddamn silhouette. Not close misses, not near misses, complete misses. The kind of shooting that makes you wonder if he's ever held a rifle before in his life. The range master just shook his head and waved him off. Another reject. Another guy who thought he could fake his way into mercenary work and found out you actually need to know which end of the rifle the bullets come out of. I was next in line. The FAL they'd handed me was well used but clean. 7.62 NATO? Good rifle? I'd fired thousands of rounds through FALs during my time in Africa. I could put 10 rounds through the same hole at 100 meters without thinking about it. Could probably do it blindfolded if someone spotted my corrections. But that was exactly the problem. The agency wanted me inside this particular mercenary recruitment operation, not as an observer, not as a temporary contractor, deep inside. They needed someone who could identify the funding sources, track where these mercenaries were being deployed, and figure out which governments or corporations were bankrolling illegal military operations across southern Africa. Which meant I needed to get recruited, but I needed to get recruited as someone they'd trust, someone they wouldn't look at twice, someone who wasn't a threat. And the best way to not look like a threat is to not look particularly capable. The range master called my name. Well, the name on my cover documents, South African passport. Private security consultant. 5 years of contract work protecting mining operations and corporate facilities across Mozambique and Angola. The whole identity was solid. Real paper trail. Real references if anyone checked. Real enough to pass scrutiny. I walked up to the firing line with the FAL and took my position. The range master explained the tests like I hadn't been watching everyone else do this for the past hour. 5 rounds, 100 meters, center mass. You'll be scored on grouping and accuracy. Questions. No questions. Begin when ready. I settled into a standing position, brought the rifle up, acquired the sight picture, and then I did something that went against every instinct I had. I aimed slightly left of center, not so far left that it looked intentional, just enough to pull my shots off target. Just enough to look like someone who could shoot but wasn't particularly good at it. First round. Hit the target left side. Low. Second round. Pulled it even further left. Still on the silhouette but nowhere near center mass. Third round. Back towards center but high. Like I was correcting but overcorrecting. Fourth round. Right side now. Still high. Like I couldn't find a consistent point of aim. Fifth round. Dead center. Finally, but only after 4 rounds of apparent incompetence. I lowered the rifle and waited for the range master to check my target. He walked downrange, examined it, made some notes on his clipboard, then walked back. You can shoot, he said, but your grouping is shit. What's your background? Security work, mostly perimeter patrol. Haven't done much precision shooting. That's obvious. He marked something on his clipboard. Wait over there with the others who passed the minimum standard. I walked to the waiting area and sat down on a wooden bench. About 15 other guys were already there. Mix of nationalities. I heard Portuguese, French, German, English with various accents. All of them had apparently passed the same minimum standard I'd just barely achieved. This was exactly where I needed to be. See, here's the thing about infiltrating a criminal organization or an illegal military operation. They're paranoid. They're looking for plants. They're looking for intelligence operatives. They're looking for anyone who seems too good to be true. And what seems too good to be true? A guy who shoots expert marksman scores? A guy who demonstrates tactical proficiency that's clearly military intelligence level? A guy who's smooth and competent and perfect? That guy gets watched. That guy gets suspected. That guy probably gets quietly eliminated before he learns anything useful. But a guy who's mediocre, a guy who can barely pass the tests, A guy who's obviously there because he needs the money and doesn't have better options, that guy's not a threat. That guy's just another desperate mercenary looking for work. They ran us through the rest of the evaluations over the next 3 days. Physical fitness test, land navigation, immediate action drills, vehicle operations, first aid assessment. Every evolution designed to weed out the guys who couldn't handle basic military tasks. And every evolution gave me another opportunity to look barely adequate. The physical fitness test was first. Run 3 miles, do 50 push-ups, do 50 sit-ups, pull-ups until failure, simple stuff. I could have crushed it. I was 40 years old and in better shape than most 25-year-olds. Years of running in the African heat had made me damn near immune to physical exhaustion. But I didn't crush it. I ran the 3 miles at a pace that put me right in the middle of the pack. Finished with enough time to pass, but not enough to stand out. When we got to the push-ups, I did 53. Not 50, not 100. 53. Just enough to clear the standard with a small margin. Sit-ups, same thing. 57. Pull-ups, I did 12 and dropped off the bar like I couldn't do another rep. Could I have done 30 pull-ups? Yeah. Probably 40 if I really pushed. But that would have made me memorable. Would have made someone wonder why a private security consultant was in Special Forces level fitness. The evaluator marked my scores and moved on. Didn't give me a second glance. Perfect. Land navigation came next. They gave us topographic maps of the area around Salisbury, a compass, and a set of grid coordinates. 4 checkpoints scattered across about 10 kilometers of bush country. 3 hours to find all 4 and return. I looked at the map and plotted the most efficient route in about 30 seconds. Could have found all 4 checkpoints in under 90 minutes, easy. Hell, I'd been doing land navigation in worse terrain than this since my first SF assignment. But I didn't take the efficient route. Instead, I plotted a route that added an extra 2 kilometers. Made it look like I was trying to avoid difficult terrain instead of moving directly toward the objectives. Started out confident. Then halfway to the first checkpoint, I stopped and checked my map like I wasn't quite sure I was going the right direction. Found the first checkpoint without much trouble. Metal stake with a colored flag. Marked down the number and moved on. Second checkpoint took me longer. I deliberately went past it by about 300 meters, then had to backtrack when I realized my mistake. Made it look like I'd misread the terrain. Found it eventually. Third checkpoint I found relatively quick, but by now I'd burned enough time that I was solidly middle of the pack in terms of performance. Fourth checkpoint was on a small hill overlooking a dry riverbed. Easy landmark navigation. I could see it from half a kilometer away. But instead of heading straight there, I went down into the riverbed first, picked my way through the rocks like I was trying to find an easier path, then climbed up to the checkpoint from the bottom instead of approaching from the high ground, added maybe 20 minutes to my time. Looked like the decision-making of someone who was thinking about comfort instead of efficiency. I got back to the start point with about 15 minutes to spare. Not great, not terrible. The evaluator checked my checkpoint markers and nodded. You found them all. Good enough. Good enough. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Immediate action drills were more complicated. They paired us up and ran us through contact scenarios. Ambush left, ambush right, near ambush, far ambush. Each team got training rifles loaded with blanks and they'd set up scenarios in the bush. My partner was a French guy named Dubois, who'd apparently been in the Foreign Legion. He knew his business, moved well, communicated clearly. I could tell within the first 30 seconds that he'd done this hundreds of times, which made my job harder. If I performed too poorly, he'd call it out. If I performed too well, I'd stand out. I needed to find that middle ground where I was adequate but not impressive. First drill was an ambush from the left. We were walking a patrol route and got hit with simulated fire from about 50 meters. Standard response: return fire, bound toward cover, establish a base of fire, maneuver on the threat. Dubois reacted instantly. I was maybe half a second behind him, not long enough to get us killed in a real situation. just long enough to suggest I wasn't operating on pure instinct. We returned fire. Bounded to cover. He went left. I went right. Good textbook response. The evaluator nodded. Adequate. Next drill. Second drill was a near ambush. Contact from 10 meters. This requires immediate aggressive response. Get off the X. Return fire. Move toward the threat if necessary. It's violent. It's instinctive. It's something you either know how to do or you don't. The simulated ambush came from our right side. Dubois saw it first and engaged immediately. I should have been right there with him. Should have been adding fire and moving to flank. But I hesitated, just for about 2 seconds. Dropped to one knee instead of staying mobile, fired a couple of rounds, stayed static. Dubois was already moving forward, engaging targets, clearing the kill zone. He looked back and saw me still kneeling in place. Move, he shouted in French accented English. Get off the X. I moved and caught up with him. We cleared the scenario together. But there'd been that gap, that hesitation, the kind of thing that suggested I knew the theory but hadn't internalized the practice. After the drill, Dubois pulled me aside. You froze, he said quietly. Just for a second. Haven't done this in a while. In a real ambush, a second is enough to die. I know, I'll be better. You better be. I don't want to work with someone who gets me killed. Understood. He walked away shaking his head, and I knew I'd achieved exactly what I wanted. He thought I was marginal, barely competent, the kind of guy you hoped wouldn't be on your team but could probably get through a contract without screwing up too badly. Perfect. The vehicle operations test came on day 3. They had us drive a Land Rover through an obstacle course, then demonstrate basic vehicle maintenance, checking oil, changing a tire, jump-starting a dead battery. Simple stuff that any competent operator should be able to do without thinking. I drove the obstacle course at a moderate pace, didn't hit any obstacles, didn't go too fast, completed it in a time that was neither impressive nor concerning. When the evaluator asked me to demonstrate vehicle maintenance, I did everything correctly but slowly. Checked the oil like I was making sure I was doing it right. Changed the tire with adequate technique, but not the speed that comes from having done it 1,000 times. The evaluator marked his checklist and moved on. By the end of day 3, they'd winnowed the group down from about 40 candidates to 12. Those of us who remained got called into a briefing room in the main building. It was hot, no air conditioning, just a ceiling fan that moved the hot air around without cooling anything. A man walked in who I hadn't seen before. Late 50s, white hair, moved with the kind of casual authority that suggested he'd been giving orders for a long time and expected them to be followed. Former military, probably British or Rhodesian. Hard to tell with the accent. Gentlemen, he said, congratulations on making it this far. You've demonstrated minimum competence in the basic skills required for the work we do. Now let me explain what that work actually is. He pulled down a map of Southern Africa, Rhodesia, Mozambique, Angola, Zambia, South Africa. The Bush War is expanding, he continued. Multiple governments and multiple factions need experienced military personnel who can operate outside official channels. We provide those personnel. You'll be contracted to various clients for periods ranging from 3 months to a year. Your job will be whatever the client needs: security work, training, indigenous forces, direct action operations, reconnaissance, whatever. He paused and looked at each of us. You will not be operating under any official flag. You will not have legal protection if you're captured. If you're killed, your body will be returned with a cover story about an accident or illness. This is the reality of mercenary work. If you're not comfortable with those terms, leave now. Nobody left. We were all too far in, too committed, too curious, or too greedy, or too desperate to walk away. Good, he said. Then let's discuss specifics. For the next 2 hours, he briefed us on the operational situation. Rhodesia was fighting a counterinsurgency against Zanla and Zipra forces. The Portuguese were fighting in Mozambique and Angola. South Africa was conducting cross-border operations into multiple neighboring countries, and various mining companies and corporate interests needed security that national militaries couldn't or wouldn't provide. This was exactly the information the agency needed. Who was hiring these mercenaries? Where were they being deployed? What were the real objectives? But I needed more than just this briefing. I needed names. I needed financial connections. I needed to understand the command structure and the money flow, which meant I needed to get selected for a deployment. After the briefing, they broke us into individual interviews, assessment of skills, discussion of preferences, contract negotiations. I sat across from the white-haired man whose name was Collins, former British Army, and listened to him evaluate my performance. "Your test results are adequate," he said, looking at papers on his desk. "Not impressive, not concerning, just adequate. Your shooting is mediocre. Your physical fitness is acceptable. Your tactical skills are functional but not refined. Your land navigation is slow but accurate." "That's a fair assessment," I said. "So why should I hire you instead of someone better?" And there it was. The question I'd been preparing for, because I'm reliable, I said. I'm not the best shooter. I'm not the fastest runner. I'm not going to win any awards for tactical brilliance, but I show up. I follow orders. I don't quit, and I don't cause problems. You want a guy who's going to be a hero? Don't hire me. You want a guy who's going to do his job and not make your life difficult? That's me. Collins studied me for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Reliability is underrated," he said, "especially in this line of work. Too many cowboys. Too many guys who think they're special. They cause more problems than they solve. I'm not a cowboy. I just need to work." Security background? 5 years in Mozambique and Angola. Corporate security. Mining facilities mostly. Perimeter work. Nothing glamorous. References? I gave him 2 names for my cover story. Both were agency assets who would confirm my employment history if contacted. Collins wrote them down. "I have a contract available," he said. 3-month deployment. Mozambique. Frelimo is pushing hard in Tet province, and one of our clients needs security for a chromite mining operation. You'd be part of a 12-man team. Straight security work. No direct action unless the facility is attacked. Interested? What's the pay? $800 per month, paid in Rhodesian dollars at the end of the contract. That was decent money for 1970. Enough to attract serious interest, enough to make a man overlook the obvious risks. "I'm interested," I said. "Good. You'll deploy in 10 days. Report back here on the 23rd at 0800 for final briefing and equipment issue. Don't be late. Don't be drunk. Don't tell anyone where you're going. Understood?" "Understood." I walked out of that office with exactly what I'd come for. A contract, a deployment, access to the internal workings of this organization, and all I'd had to do was convince them I was barely competent enough to be useful. 10 days later, I was back at the compound outside Salisbury. The 12-man team assembled at 8 o'clock in the morning. I recognized a few faces from the evaluation course. Dubois was there, a Portuguese guy named Costa, a South African named Van Wyk, who didn't talk much but had the look of someone who'd seen serious combat. The rest were new. Germans, British, one American from somewhere in the South. All of us had passed the same mediocre standard I'd passed. All of us were supposedly adequate but unexceptional. Collins briefed us on the mission. The chromite mine was in Tet province, about 30 kilometers from the Rhodesian border. Frelimo forces had been probing the area for the past 2 months. Small raids. Harassment. Nothing sustained but enough to make the mining company nervous. Our job was simple. Establish a defensive perimeter around the mine, run security patrols in the surrounding area, and prevent Frelimo from interfering with operations. Rules of engagement were straightforward. Anyone approaching the mine with weapons was a hostile target. They issued us Equipment: FNFAL rifles, 8 magazines each, loaded with 20 rounds of 7.62 NATO, web gear, canteens, first aid kits, no body armor, no radios beyond 2 PRC-77s for the team. This was bare-bones security work. We loaded into 2 Land Rovers and drove east toward the Mozambique border, crossed at an unmarked point where someone had obviously paid off the border guards, continued into Tet Province on dirt roads that barely qualified as roads, arrived at the mine site just before dark. The facility was smaller than I'd expected. 1 main building, 2 equipment sheds, a generator that sounded like it was about to die. The actual mining operation was an open pit about 200 meters from the buildings, maybe 30 local workers, a handful of Portuguese supervisors. No visible security except for us. Collins split us into 3 teams of 4. I got assigned to Van Wyck's team along with Costa and a German named Hoffman. Van Wyck made it clear he was in charge. We run 24-hour security, he said in Afrikaans accented English. 8-hour rotations. 1 team on perimeter patrol, 1 team on facility security, 1 team resting. Simple. Don't complicate it. We established defensive positions around the perimeter. Nothing sophisticated, just observation posts with clear fields of fire and overlapping sectors. Van Wyck positioned me on the eastern side of the perimeter where the road approached the mine. Anyone comes down that road, you challenge them, he said. If they don't stop, you fire a warning shot. If they keep coming, you engage. Clear? Clear. Good. First patrol starts in 30 minutes. The first week was quiet. We ran patrols, stood guard duty, watched local workers move ore from the pit to the processing facility. Nothing happened. No Frelimo. No raids. Just heat and boredom and mosquitoes, which gave me time to observe, time to gather intelligence, time to figure out what this operation was really about. The first thing I noticed was the ore. They were pulling chromite out of that pit, yeah, but not in quantities that justified this level of security. Maybe 2 trucks per week leaving the facility. That was it. For a mining operation supposedly important enough to hire a 12-man mercenary team, the production was laughably small. Second thing I noticed was the Portuguese supervisors. They weren't mining engineers. I'd worked enough mining operations to know what engineers look like. These guys look like intelligence officers. The way they carried themselves, the way they communicated, the way they watched everything and everyone. Third thing I noticed was the paperwork. Collins had us signing security logs every day, patrol routes, contact reports, equipment status, normal stuff. But he was also having the team leaders file detailed reports about Frelimo activity in the area, suspected positions, movement patterns, vehicle sightings, stuff that went way beyond simple security work. This wasn't a mining operation. This was an intelligence collection point. The mine was a cover for monitoring Frelimo movements in Tet Province. The mercenary team wasn't there to protect ore. We were there to provide security for intelligence officers who were mapping enemy positions and reporting back to someone, probably Rhodesian intelligence or South African intelligence or maybe both. And the ore shipments? Probably just enough real mining to maintain the cover story. This was exactly the kind of operation the agency wanted to know about. Illegal cross-border intelligence operations disguised as commercial activity, mercenaries providing security for operations that would be politically impossible for official military forces. I started documenting everything, memorizing names, tracking vehicle movements, noting which Portuguese supervisors talked to which visitors, building a complete picture of the operation. But I had to do it carefully. Had to maintain my cover as a mediocre security contractor who was just here for the paycheck. Second week, things got interesting. We were running a patrol about 5 kilometers from the mine, me, Hoffman, and 2 guys from another team when we spotted movement in the tree line ahead. Maybe 10 or 12 individuals, moving parallel to the road. Armed. Hoffman saw them first. He was on point. He raised his fist, the signal to halt, and we all dropped into cover positions along the roadside. "Frelimo," Hoffman whispered. "Maybe a dozen. AK-47s, moving west." "Toward the mine?" I asked. "Could be. Or just passing through." "We engage?" "Wait." We waited. Watched them through the bush. They were moving tactically, spacing, cover. These weren't amateurs. These were trained fighters who knew what they were doing. After about 5 minutes, they moved out of visual range, continued west. Hoffman keyed his radio and reported the contact to Van Wyck back at the mine. "Copy." Van Wyck's voice crackled. "Return to base. We'll establish defensive positions in case they're probing." We moved back to the mine at a fast patrol pace. Arrived to find the rest of the team already positioned in the defensive perimeter. Collins was there too. He'd driven out from Salisbury specifically to deal with this situation. "Where were they headed?" Collins asked Hoffman. "West, parallel to the road. Could be moving toward the mine or could be en route to somewhere else." "How many?" 12 approximately. All armed with AK-47s, one RPG that I saw. Collins thought for a moment. Then he made a decision. "We're going to track them. 4-man team, light and fast, see where they're going and what they're doing. Hoffman, you're team leader. Take Costa, take Van Wyck, and take..." He looked at the rest of us. His eyes settled on me. "Take Waugh." My stomach dropped slightly. I hadn't expected to get pulled for the tracking mission. I'd positioned myself as mediocre, as someone you wouldn't choose for important work. But apparently mediocre was good enough when you needed bodies. "Yes, sir," I said. "You'll move out in 30 minutes. Pack light. 2 days. Food and water. Radios. No vehicles. You're on foot. Track them. Find out where they're going. Report back. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. This is reconnaissance only. Understood?" We all nodded. 30 minutes later, we were moving west into the bush, following the trail left by the Frelimo patrol. Tracking a military patrol through African bush requires patience. You're not following footprints like some Hollywood movie. You're looking for disturbances, broken branches, disturbed vegetation, scuff marks on rocks, the subtle signs that 12 men with heavy weapons have passed through an area. Hoffman was good at it. He'd done tracking work before. Costa was adequate. Van Wyck was solid. And I was deliberately staying in the middle of the competency range, not leading, not lagging, just following and doing what I was told. We tracked them for about 6 hours. They were moving toward a village about 15 kilometers west of the mine. Small place, maybe 200 people, not marked on any official maps. As we got closer, Hoffman signaled us to slow down. We moved into a position on high ground overlooking the village, set up observation, and watched. The Frelimo patrol entered the village around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. They weren't hostile, weren't aggressive. They were clearly familiar with the villagers. People came out to greet them. Kids ran up to the soldiers. Women brought food and water. This was a support base, a friendly village that provided logistics and intelligence to Frelimo forces operating in the area. We watched for 2 hours, documented everything. Number of fighters, weapons, vehicle. They had one old truck parked behind the main building. The layout of the village, defensive positions. This was valuable intelligence, the kind of information that Rhodesian or South African forces could use to plan a raid or an airstrike, but it was also the kind of information that would get 200 civilians killed. I watched those kids playing in the village square, watched women preparing food, watched old men sitting in the shade talking, and I knew that our reconnaissance report was probably going to result in violence against people who had no choice about being caught in the middle of this war. But that wasn't my mission. My mission was to gather intelligence on the mercenary operation, not to make moral judgments about the consequences. We pulled back after dark, moved about 3 kilometers away, and set up a cold camp, no fire, no light. Hoffman radioed back to Collins and gave him the full report. Collins acknowledged and told us to maintain observation for another 24 hours to see if the Frelimo patrol moved out or if more fighters arrived. We spent the next day watching the village from concealment. No additional fighters arrived. The original patrol stayed put. Seemed like this was a rest stop or a logistics point. On the afternoon of the second day, Collins radioed and told us to return to the mine. We'd gathered enough information. We patrolled back and arrived at the mine site just before dark. Collins was waiting for us with the Portuguese supervisors. He debriefed us immediately. Wanted every detail about the village. Location, layout, numbers, weapons, vehicle, everything. I gave my report along with everyone else. Kept it professional, factual. Didn't editorialize. Didn't express any concerns about what would happen to that village. After the debrief, Collins pulled me aside. "You did good work out there," he said. "Hoffman says you kept up, didn't slow the team down, followed orders, just did the job," I said. "That's what I like to hear. Most guys want to be heroes. You just want to do the job and get paid. That's the right attitude for this work." He walked away, and I realized I had achieved something important. I'd moved from barely adequate security contractor to someone they trusted enough to send on reconnaissance missions. I was getting deeper into the organization, which meant I was in a position to gather the intelligence the agency actually needed. Third week at the mine, I started working on the real mission. See, security work and reconnaissance patrols were fine, but what the agency wanted was bigger picture intelligence. Who was funding these operations? Who was providing the logistics? Who was receiving the intelligence we were gathering? What was the command structure connecting mercenary recruiters like Collins to the people actually making decisions? I needed access to communications. I needed to see documents. I needed to understand how money flowed through this organization, which meant I needed a reason to be near the command post. The opportunity came during a routine equipment check. Our team's PRC-77 radio had been acting up. Intermittent transmission, weak signal, normal wear and tear on old equipment. Van Wyck mentioned it to Collins during an evening briefing. Collins cursed and said we couldn't operate without reliable communications. "Anyone here know radio maintenance?" Collins asked the assembled team. I raised my hand. "I've done some field repairs, basic stuff. Might be able to diagnose the problem." Collins looked at me with slight surprise. "You didn't mention radio experience during your evaluation? Didn't think it mattered. You needed security contractors, not communication specialists." "Well, it matters now. Take a look at it. See if you can fix it. If not, we'll have to get a replacement sent out from Salisbury." I took the radio back to the main building where Collins had set up his command post. It was a small office. Desk, maps on the wall, radio equipment, filing cabinets, and most importantly, paperwork. I spent about an hour working on the radio. The problem was actually simple: corroded connection in the power supply. I could have fixed it in 10 minutes, but I took my time, made it look like I was troubleshooting carefully, and while I worked, I observed everything in that office. There was a filing cabinet in the corner, not locked. I could see files visible through the partially open drawer, personnel records probably, maybe financial documents. There was a larger radio setup on the desk. Looked like a PRC-77 modified for extended range. Collins used this to communicate with someone back in Salisbury. I needed to know who he was talking to and what they were discussing. And there was a map on the wall with markings, red pins, blue pins, lines drawn between locations. This was operational planning, the kind of map that shows where forces are positioned and where operations are planned. I fixed the radio, tested it, confirmed it was working. Then I reported to Collins. "Fixed," I said. "Corrosion in the power supply. Should be good now." "Excellent. Thank you. You need me to check the other team radios? Make sure they're not having the same problem?" "Good idea. Do that." "Perfect. I'd just given myself a reason to spend time in the command posts on a regular basis. Radio maintenance, equipment checks, perfectly legitimate reason to be near sensitive information. Over the next week, I made it my business to check every radio we had. Some needed maintenance, some didn't, but it gave me access to the command post at various times throughout the day and night. And I used that access. I started with a filing cabinet, waited until Collins was out on patrol with one of the other teams. The Portuguese supervisors were at the mine pit. I was alone in the command post, supposedly doing radio maintenance. I opened the filing cabinet and quickly photographed documents with a miniature camera I'd hidden in my equipment, personnel files, contract details, financial records showing payments from a company called Consolidated African Resources. Never heard of them. Probably a shell company. I found correspondence between Collins and someone in Salisbury named Whitmore. The letters discussed operations beyond just this mine, references to other security contracts in Angola, Mozambique, Zambia. This wasn't just one mine. This was a network of operations. I photographed everything I could in the 10 minutes I had before I heard voices approaching the building. Closed the filing cabinet, went back to working on a radio. Collins walked in. "How's it going?" "Almost done. This one had the same corrosion problem. Should be fixed now." "Good. We need reliable comms. Frelimo's been more active lately. Can't afford equipment failure." He sat down at his desk and started working on paperwork. I finished up the radio, tested it, packed up my tools, and left. Back at my position on the perimeter, I transcribed everything I'd seen into a coded message for my handler. Used a simple substitution cipher that looked like a personal letter if anyone intercepted it. Talked about visiting family and discussing business opportunities. Anyone reading it would think it was routine correspondence, but my handler would understand I'd found the organizational structure, found the shell company, found references to operations in multiple countries. This was exactly the kind of intelligence the agency needed. Fourth week, Collins announced we were getting resupplied. A supply convoy was coming from Salisbury with food, ammunition, fuel, and replacement equipment. Expected arrival in 2 days. When the convoy arrives, Collins told us during the evening briefing, "We'll pull everyone in for inventory and distribution. No patrols while we're handling supplies. We secure the perimeter and process everything. Should take 4 to 6 hours." This was interesting. A supply convoy meant logistics, meant someone was providing material support, meant I could potentially identify vehicles, drivers, maybe even intercept documentation showing where the supplies came from and who paid for them. The convoy arrived at 10 o'clock in the morning 2 days later. 3 trucks, 1 Land Rover Escort, 5 personnel including the drivers. Collins had us establish security while they unloaded. I positioned myself where I could observe the documentation process, watch them check invoices, see what paperwork changed hands. And that's when I saw something interesting. One of the drivers was talking to Collins, handing over paperwork. I was close enough to hear part of the conversation. "Whitmore says the contract's been extended," the driver said. "Another 3 months, same terms." "Good. We need the stability." He also says there's interest in expanding operations. Maybe 2 more sites in Mozambique, 1 in Angola. "We have the personnel for that?" "He's recruiting now. Should have another 20 guys trained and ready by next month." Collins nodded and signed something. The driver walked back to his truck. I just heard confirmation that Whitmore was running a larger operation. Multiple sites. Ongoing recruitment. This wasn't just a single mining operation. This was a systematic program to deploy mercenaries across southern Africa under commercial cover. That evening, I updated my coded message, added the new intelligence, prepared to pass it to my handler at the next dead drop. 5th week, the situation changed. Frelimo hit the village we'd reconnoitered, not our team. This was a Rhodesian ground attack supported by airstrikes. They went in at dawn, killed maybe 30 Frelimo fighters, destroyed the truck, burned buildings, and killed civilians. Lots of civilians. Because when you bomb a village that's providing support to insurgents, You can't separate the combatants from the non-combatants. I heard about it from Collins. He seemed satisfied with the results. Our reconnaissance made that operation possible, he said during a briefing. Good intelligence leads to successful operations. This is why we're here. The Portuguese supervisors agreed. They were pleased. The Frelimo presence in Tet province had been reduced. The mine could operate with less threat. But I kept thinking about those kids I'd seen playing in the village square, about the women preparing food, about the old men in the shade. And I realized something important about this work. When you gather intelligence, you're responsible for what happens with that intelligence. You can't just collect information and pretend you're not part of the consequences. But that wasn't a judgment I could afford to make right now. I had a mission: infiltrate the mercenary network, identify command structure, document operations, report back to the agency. Personal feelings didn't matter. The mission mattered. 6 weeks, my contract was coming to an end. Collins called me into the command post for a final evaluation. Your performance has been adequate, he said. Not exceptional, but reliable. You follow orders. You don't cause problems. You've proven useful with the radio maintenance work. Thank you. I'm authorized to offer you another contract, 3 months, same location, same terms. Interested? This was the decision point. I could accept another contract, stay embedded in the operation, gather more intelligence. But staying longer meant increased risk of exposure, meant more time where someone might figure out I wasn't who I claimed to be. Or I could decline, take what I'd learned, and report back to my handler. Let the agency decide what to do with the intelligence. I appreciate the offer, I said, but I need to decline. Got some personal business back in South Africa that needs attention. Maybe I can come back in a few months. Collins nodded. Understood. If you're available later, contact us. We can always use reliable people. I'll do that. 2 days later, I was back in Salisbury. Collins paid me in Rhodesian dollars as promised. Shook my hand. Told me to stay in touch. I never saw him again. I met my handler in Johannesburg 3 days later. Passed him the intelligence I'd gathered, the organizational structure, the shell company, the names of key personnel, the documentation of operations in multiple countries. This is excellent work, he said after reviewing my reports. Confirms what we suspected. Whitmore's running a network that's deploying mercenaries to support Rhodesian and South African intelligence operations under commercial cover. Multiple mining companies acting as fronts. Multiple locations, probably several dozen mercenaries total. What happens now, I asked. We pass this up the chain. State Department will probably want to approach the Rhodesian government through back channels, make it clear we know what they're doing, apply some diplomatic pressure to shut it down, or at least scale it back. And the mercenaries? Most of them are just contractors looking for work. They're not the real target. We want the people running the operation, the funding sources, the government officials who authorize this. Collins? He's mid-level. Useful, but not critical. We'll keep tabs on him. See if he leads us to bigger fish. My handler looked at me carefully. You took a risk with this one. Deliberately underperforming during the evaluation. That could have backfired. They could have just rejected you outright. It was a calculated risk, I said. They were looking for specific traits. I gave them what they wanted. By failing their tests just enough to look trustworthy. Sometimes the best cover is incompetence. He smiled slightly. Not a technique they teach in training. No, but it works. Looking back on that operation years later, I realized it taught me something important about intelligence work, about infiltration, about how you get inside organizations that are actively looking for people like you. The natural instinct is to be the best, to demonstrate competence, to show everyone how capable you are. That's what we're trained to do. That's what years of military service teaches you. But intelligence work requires different instincts. Sometimes you need to be less than your best. Sometimes you need to look flawed. Sometimes you need to convince people you're not a threat because you're not particularly capable. It goes against everything you've learned. It requires ego suppression on a level that's genuinely difficult. You have to watch people think you're mediocre and accept that judgment without correcting it. But that's the price of admission. That's how you get inside, by being exactly what they're looking for instead of what you actually are. The mercenary operation in Tet Province eventually shut down, not because of my intelligence, not because of diplomatic pressure. It shut down because the political situation changed. Mozambique gained independence in 1975. Frelimo took power. The Rhodesian Bush War intensified, and the kind of covert operations we'd been running became too visible to maintain. But the lesson stayed with me. In intelligence work, your best asset isn't always your capability. Sometimes it's your perceived lack of capability. Sometimes it's the fact that nobody's watching you closely because they don't think you're worth watching. I spent years after that operation using the same technique, deliberately underperforming, looking adequate but not exceptional, getting into places by being exactly mediocre enough to be trusted. It's a hard thing to do. Your ego fights against it. Your training fights against it. Everything you've learned about being a professional soldier tells you to be the best at everything you do. But intelligence work isn't soldiering. It's deception. And sometimes the best deception is looking like you're not very good at deception at all. That village, those kids, that airstrike. I still think about it sometimes, about the consequences of the intelligence I gathered, about whether it was worth it, about whether the operational success justified the civilian casualties. I don't have good answers. Never did. Still don't. But I learned to live with those questions. Learn to accept that intelligence work means being responsible for consequences you can't control. Learn to carry the weight of decisions that weren't yours to make, but were enabled by information you provided. That's the real cost of this work. Not the danger, not the risk of getting caught. The cost is carrying the knowledge of what your intelligence enabled. What happened because of information you gathered. The second order and third order effects that ripple out from a single reconnaissance report or a single piece of documentation, you learn to live with it, or you get out. I stayed in, kept working, kept gathering intelligence, kept using the same technique of strategic incompetence whenever I needed to infiltrate an organization that was looking for people like me. Worked every time, because nobody suspects the mediocre guy. Nobody watches the adequate performer. Nobody assumes the barely competent contractor is actually an intelligence operative. That's the lesson. That's what I learned in Tet Province in 1970. Sometimes failing is the best way to succeed. Sometimes looking weak is the strongest position you can take. Sometimes the worst shot in the room is actually the most dangerous person there. You just have to be willing to let people think you're less than you are. You have to be willing to accept their judgment without correcting it. You have to be willing to suppress every instinct that tells you to prove yourself. That's the price. That's the cost. That's what it takes to get inside. And once you're inside, once they trust you because they don't think you're capable enough to be a threat, that's when you do your real work. That's when you gather the intelligence that matters. That's when you complete the mission by being exactly what they're looking for instead of what you actually are. Never forget that. In this work, your greatest weapon is sometimes being underestimated. Your greatest advantage is sometimes appearing disadvantaged. Your greatest strength is sometimes looking weak. Use it, master it, make it part of who you are when you're operating, because the enemy is always looking for threats. They're looking for people who are too good, too skilled, too capable. They're not looking for the mediocre guy who barely passed the tests. Be that guy, and then do the work that actually matters.